into the existing governance of that of core sector in those countries. Also, relating to the need to align different land use strategies, there's also the issue how you actually integrate REDD+ into all these different sectors without diluting too much attention and resources that has been designated to forest. And also, we also find the issue of benefit sharing, how you ensure effective and fair, equitable benefit sharing within the different stakeholders is also a key issue. And with continued collaboration with IUCN, we decided that the next phase of the dialogue will focusing on the benefit sharing mechanisms. Because given its importance in the whole REDD+ discussions and also the existing vast body and the on-the-ground projects that we have worked on. But of course, that all these different issues are interlinked with each other. You can't really talk about benefit sharing without talking about who owns the rest of the commodity. And you can't really talk about benefit sharing without knowing who you should engage in the different stakeholders mechanisms that you can use to develop this benefit sharing system. And so that's why we have this idea of having everyone here as the Congress taking this opportunity to build on your experience and wisdom on what you think are the existing learning experiences for REDD+, and also looking outside of our sector, what are the existing practices, case studies we can use to help reform our thinking on developing benefit sharing system for REDD+. At the same time, we also want to discuss with you where you think that this kind of core style of multi-stakeholder processes can contribute further to the existing body of work on REDD+ benefit sharing. And I'll stop here and I'll hand to Patrick to give us a little bit one lesson on what are we talking about, what is benefit sharing, and what are the current thinking of benefit sharing.
Perfect, thanks, Jen. And so I'm going to preface this at the beginning with two things. I like working with the Forest Dialogue because they structure things in a way that we don't necessarily start. There's a very structured process, it's a very helpful process. So my job is not to influence what you think and try and commit to something like most of the presentations we've had so far in Congress. My job is to get everyone up to speed so that we have a basic level of understanding. It might be above where you are, it might be below where you are, but the idea is that we have an equal footing. What I'm going to do is, I'm going to start off by pointing this from the right. And say that everyone has a say at the end of the day in benefit sharing. That's part of our conversation, is that everyone has a say and we need to figure out who everyone is. But in the context of benefit sharing itself, there's lots of different versions of it. And I'm not going to read it, but at the end of the day, FAO started off at the beginning by basically saying that it's as simple as agreements between stakeholders for equitable distribution of benefits. Gary told me I'm supposed to challenge you at some point, so I'm going to highlight the last part that's not in bold, which is related to the commercialization of carbon. And I think we will probably get into some discussions later on to what extent carbon and benefit sharings for REDD are there, but I think that that's an essential part. Here at IUCN, we distill it down a little bit and just take out what the definite stakeholders are. We've done a fair amount of work on benefit sharing in the past few years, but I think one thing I think is fairly clear. Jiating put up that slide with the timeline and the way that REDD+ has evolved. We've gone from very few countries being involved and very few letters to over 75 countries that are REDD+ countries that are involved. There's a lot of expertise there. There's a lot of wisdom. But at the end of the day, we're only 7 years into something. It's a 7-year-old idea. It hasn't been developed very far. And so I think what we need to consider is that, I think Jiating put it right, that we're not talking about So, other than what we have in our glossy brochure, what do the academics say? And as usual, we can make something incredibly simple as distributing benefits, equitably distributing benefits among stakeholders, incredibly complicated. This comes from an academic paper of a very well-known forest researcher, and something that is incredibly useful once you get into the very detailed portions of a benefit sharing system. There's all sorts of different pillars. But as I said, I want to get back to basics and just make sure that we all have the understanding of what we consider IUCN. So there's three key elements that we want to work from in the benefit sharing system. Benefit sharing is not a new concept with REDD. It's something that's existed. We've had natural resources before. We've had different commodity types before. We have oil, we have natural gas, we have minerals, we have conservation projects. We even have social welfare systems that distribute things like unemployment insurance and social safety nets. So I think one of the things that we need to consider, though, is that the scale of REDD Plus payments, as we know it, for an exchange of money in exchange for equitable distribution for action towards commercialization of carbon, has never been done before. We've never had natural gas projects that try and distribute an unknown commodity. So carbon is an unknown resource, realistically, in terms of natural resource tenure. We've never tried to distribute a volume of cash out to households and to people that we're not sure who the rights belong to. And so it's going to challenge when we take past examples from payment for ecosystem services for water, which is something that many people think about when they think of benefit sharing systems for REDD Plus. Examples like Costa Rica often come up. But the simple fact of the matter is the volume of cash that will be distributed is going to be extremely high. And that's going to make, although things are scalable, it certainly brings into question about whether or not all the checks and balances that would be included are still going to work. So we need to think about scalability when we use our examples. So we're talking about a balance at the end of the day. We're balancing objectives. We need to balance an incentive that will actually drive action. And so that's on the actual carbon side of things. And we need to talk about legitimacy. People need to believe in the system that's going to deliver the money for which they've made a tangible change. And so one of the difficulties is when you add in, and one of the things to consider is when you add in too many people in the payment system for people that haven't undertaken action, you potentially water down the effectiveness. Not everyone's getting the amount of money that they think they should be getting for what's there. So what, at the end of the day, we need to balance between is providing effective incentive and being able to develop broad support and legitimacy for that REDD Plus system. We remember the complicated academic arrows and boxes and flowcharts and all that stuff. That doesn't work in communities. You can't put that slide up and someone knows what it is. It's a black box. At the end of the day, people know that if they do something differently, they're going to receive money. And that's the hope. And there has to be a trust that that black box works. So, great. At the very basics, that some people come in and I recognize a lot of faces around here. I don't recognize a lot of faces. So again, starting on the basics. At the very least, we know, and I can click it forward. I'm not sure if someone's clicking it in the back, but it'd be helpful if we didn't. International REDD Plus finance flows into a national fund. So we know from a global account, it has not yet been determined, and as Xiaoting outlined, things are going slowly. We all know that things aren't advancing necessarily on climate negotiations as quick as we'd like, but we know that the idea is that money transfers from a global fund to a country. And then we know that we have two types of benefit sharing. We have vertical and horizontal benefit sharing. Vertical benefit sharing, we distribute things through the different layers of government that we have. And we know that in certain countries rather than others, the role of central government versus regional government versus local government is very much different. So the design of your benefit sharing is going to be very different. In Indonesia, the role of regional governments has a very different role compared to a centralized federal system. So within that, ultimately what we're trying to do is we're then looking to have horizontal benefit sharing systems. So once it gets to the local government side, then we have three things to consider. We're essentially we always talk about trying to transfer money to households. That's one part of it. But we also need to think about distribution within the community and between communities, because although forest carbon is measured on a hectare of change or a single tree of change in a hedgerow, if you can measure it, at the end of the day, these are under REDD Plus. The change in emissions, the change in your actual forest carbon is calculated at a national level. And so you can't tie it to a single piece of land. And so we need to think about not just a single household where the action happened, but how are those benefits going to be shared within the communities? This is sometimes talking to some of the questions about land use, but then between communities, getting into some of the urban and rural issues that were raised in the leaders' dialogue last night. So we then have one other piece, and this is as complicated as it gets, is we have the usual flow, which is fund-based, which we usually talk about for REDD Plus, which is the global mechanism for global to national down to local. But we can skip all the stuff in the middle, and we have the voluntary market, which is project-based carbon projects, voluntary offsets, and green stewardship. So what I would say is we can certainly get more in-depth things, and I'm sure we will as we go into the breakout sessions and through the very well-structured TFB dialogue process. But what I would say is just 5 key considerations when we're thinking about the design of benefit sharing systems themselves. We need to think about the stakeholder engagement side of it. We need to think about the design of the incentive itself that's going to transfer the money and change action. We need to think about how the funding would be transferred, so the delivery mechanism for the funds. We need to think about transparency provisions, which means how do we ensure that in the design of the process, everyone knows how it was designed, so there's not little offshoots going off to the left and right. We know that there will be costs along the way other than the different levels of government, for project developers, for facilitators. But what we need to know is where all those different pieces come in and out. You need to understand your banking system in order to have confidence that when you put money in your checking account, that you would be able to get all that money back out without it coming back as a little bit smaller. And the last is when all the other stuff goes wrong, 1 through 4, you need to know who you can go to and how you're going to go about resolving conflict. So you need a dispute settlement system. And the only thing that I would add to that is that that's not just many of these are not unique to benefit sharing systems. The dispute settlement is probably with the benefit sharing system, the piece that is the last thing that's thought of, but most likely has to be discussed when you're up under the first one, under stakeholder engagement. When people go into a process, the design of the process itself is going to have to be part of the dispute settlement process. You need to be able to know who you can go to if you don't trust the system that's being designed. So with that, what I would say as I go to the next slide, and not hopefully 2, is that there is an emerging body of work. I think if I were to characterize Jiaoting's, or summarize Jiaoting's summary slide that was there, which is that we've added a lot of letters and we've gone from REDD to REDD to REDD Plus. And that's great. I'm not sure if we're going to add a color patch to it next or what we're going to do after the plus sign. I'm sure we'll try and do something. In the past few years, though, instead of adding letters to it, what the global community's been looking at is we've moved to safeguards and monitoring, reporting, and verification, MRV. But at the end of the day, all those things are one step as we go towards performance-based payments. So in exchange for action, you will get funding. And as we go to that, we're starting to see an emerging body of work coming out on benefit sharing. In the top left, you'll see a piece that came out a couple years ago that IACN released on REDD Plus and benefit sharing. You'll see the TFD review, a number of other pieces. Some of you were at the Pro4 event the other day on benefit sharing. There are people that are starting to work at it. It's not a new idea, but we certainly need to start looking at and having dialogues like this about benefit sharing, because it's the last piece that people are discussing. But at the end of the day, I think we've heard many different leaders' dialogues and things like that we're talking about livelihoods, we're talking about distribution. And so at the end of the day, that comes down to benefit sharing systems. Taking money in exchange for changing your behavior. So with that, I will not try and operate this little remote anymore. And I will hand it back to John.
So I won't take too long. So before I hand it to you guys to give your input. I'm going to represent the 200 plus stakeholder engagement on readiness process and make a pitch of what they find about what Patrick highlighted as key issues. So some of the challenges identified through looking at the 5-country examples through our dialogue is that we need to recognize there's a difference between benefits and revenue. So for benefits, we're talking about not only the monetary benefits that people will get, it's also non-monetary benefits. And they usually get even murkier when you go to those intangible benefits, how you actually quantify them, how do you distribute them, how do you even need to quantify them. So there's a lot of intertangled challenge and issue we need to think through there. And also, like, who is going to provide those benefits that are coming in? At the international negotiation level, there's still not a really clear definition and the framework on how the market-based mechanism and the non-market mechanism can interact with each other. And will there be a role for the market, and how will the role of the market will play out? The countries, a lot of countries we talk to, they get a little bit anxious when we talk about fund-only mechanism for REDD, because they don't know whether the donor will give them continued money in the end, whether it will come up and down with the economy, what are the insurance out there, and how much those fund-based mechanisms will go into all these countries to prevent leakage at the international level is still quite unclear. And how much benefits will flow in. A lot of people want to jump into designing the system, but in Cambodia, when we talk to the government about designing a system for beneficiary to the local community, they're eager to do that, but they're hesitant to put a percentage on it because they don't know how much benefits come in, and they want to cover their costs too, even with really good intentions when they want to share with the community. So people getting a little bit anxious of how much benefits there will be, whether there will be incentive to prevent, to actually deter those drivers of deforestation, and also besides with who is going to make the pie, how big the pie is, and also who is going to share the pie here. Are those drivers of deforestation, are the bad guys going to share the pie, or the rights holders? Who are the rights holders? And how you can ensure, as Patrick pointed out, that the delivery system is also fair and effective. And there's also reflecting on some of the CDM examples that in the past there was also worry whether the big project will get rewarded, while some of the small scale project with relatively high percentage of cost will be ignored. So the participants also think through some of the ways forward on those issues that they faced. In terms of the transparency provision, as Patrick pointed out, some of the existing examples come from Brazil, where there's a designated national fund for REDD+, where there's a specific transparency provision for that type of fund. So instead of letting the REDD money disappear in the national budget, this designated fund is monitored at the international level by different stakeholders to ensure the transparency at the national level. And also, there's an emphasis on participatory design, and we saw it clear in Ghana that the local community knows exactly what they want and the type of beneficiary system that they need. So in those cases, it's quite, the government finds it's really effective to engage those stakeholders, getting their ideas on how they want the benefit to be distributed, and based on their customer and system that they're used to, and they can quickly adapt for REDD+. And also, this emphasis on active involvement of private sector. Although at the international level, we don't know how the market-based mechanism can work out, the private sector has a lot to offer in understanding how you can actually channel this type of investment, which here is the carbon investment, into the community. So there's a lot of wisdom that can be shared there, and but they're actually missing from the table of discussion when we're talking about beneficiary. And in Guatemala and Ecuador, we saw that the government already has different payment to communities to encourage the community forestry practices. And those existing beneficiary system really is something that we should build on instead of reinventing the wheel. and linking to the challenge that the grant money may not be enough. A lot of participants says that we really should see REDD Plus benefits as only one egg in the basket and look at a diversified commodity and the services that we can build around the governance and capacity building for REDD Plus, and making sure that the community has different access to different benefits, and making sure that there's a buffer zone for any of the unexpected uncertainty with certain different types of investment. And the last but not least, that some of participants think that there's too much emphasis right now. We're talking about how much revenue, but people are really not talking about how much cost there are related to different beneficiary mechanisms. Whether we should think through what type of costs are related to beneficiary and choose those mechanisms that can minimize those costs. Since we all know that the pie is limited and there's a lot of people really want to grab into it. So that's basically what